Just wait until after the wedding. 5 words. That's all it took for my mother to ask me to risk my life. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. Abby Brooks had waited 2 years for the phone call that finally came on a gray Tuesday morning in April. 2 years of dialysis 3 times a week, 2 years of counting hours between treatments, of watching the skin on her arms bruise and heal and bruise again until she stopped wearing short sleeves even in the middle of summer. 2 years of hoping for something she'd almost stopped believing would come. And then it came. A perfect match. Her closest friend since college, Rachel Monroe, had been tested and approved as a kidney donor. The transplant was scheduled for the 3rd week of June. Abby remembered sitting in her car outside the transplant center afterward, crying so hard she had to wait 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She called her mother first, because some part of her still believed that good news might finally be enough to make her feel like she belonged in her own family. Diane Brooks went quiet on the other end of the line for a moment too long. "That's wonderful, honey," she finally said. "But the 3rd week of June, isn't that awfully close to Claire's wedding?" Abby laughed. Actually laughed because surely her mother was joking. The wedding was in July. There was nearly a month between the 2 dates. But Diane wasn't joking. She could hear it in the silence that followed, the particular silence of a woman already doing calculations, recovery time, hospital stays, whether her daughter would look pale in the wedding photographs, whether people would ask uncomfortable questions about the sister who just had surgery. That should have told Abby everything she needed to know about where she stood in this family. It would take a great deal more heartbreak before she truly understood it. From the outside, the Brooks family looked like something out of a magazine spread on the American dream. Thomas Brooks was a respected financial advisor in their small Indiana town, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered everyone's names at church. Diane volunteered for every charity function in the county and was known throughout their community as endlessly warm, endlessly giving. And Claire, beautiful, effortless, magnetic Claire, had built a modest online following documenting her dream wedding journey, complete with flower mock-ups, dress fittings, and captions about gratitude and blessings. Only Abby knew what it cost to keep that image so polished. She had grown up in Claire's shadow without ever being invited to stand beside her in the light. Every birthday grew smaller and quieter once Claire's celebrations grew bigger. Every school award Abby brought home was met with a polite nod before the conversation drifted back to whatever Claire had accomplished that week. When Abby got sick, really sick, kidney failure sick, some small, stubborn part of her had hoped the illness might finally make her visible. Instead, it became one more inconvenient interruption to a performance the family had been rehearsing her whole life. "I just don't understand why it has to be exactly then," Diane said one evening, 3 weeks before the scheduled surgery. Abby sat across the kitchen table from her, hollowed out from dialysis, her hands still faintly yellow with bruising. The overhead light hummed. Somewhere down the hall, Claire was on the phone with the florist, laughing about peonies. "Mom," Abby said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, "the doctor said if we delay this, there's real risk. My kidney function drops a little more every month. If I stay on dialysis longer than I have to, it could cause permanent damage. This isn't something I can just move like a hair appointment." "I know, sweetheart, I know it's frightening, but could you talk to the doctors? Just ask if there's any flexibility. A few weeks, that's all we're asking." Abby looked down the table at her father. Thomas kept his eyes on his coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands, saying nothing. Later that night, after Diane had gone to bed, Abby found her in the kitchen and spoke quietly, almost like a confession. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll make sure your date stays exactly as planned. This is your health, Abby. Nothing is more important than that. She wanted so badly to believe him that she let herself. 3 days later, sitting in the transplant coordinator's office with both her parents present, Abby heard the words that would end something inside her that never fully grew back. "We were wondering," Thomas said, not meeting his daughter's eyes, "if there's any way to push the date back, just slightly. Family circumstances." The coordinator glanced at Abby, waiting for her to object. Abby opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She was 20 years old, still on her parents' insurance, exhausted in every way a person can be exhausted, and utterly unequipped to fight two adults who had clearly decided the outcome before she'd even sat down in that chair. The surgery was postponed 6 weeks. What followed was, in Abby's memory, one of the strangest and most painful stretches of her life. She watched her parents spend astonishing amounts of money, floral arrangements flown in from out of state, a 5-tier custom cake, a live string quartet for the reception, while she quietly wondered if she'd be able to afford her next round of prescriptions. She never said a word. She had learned long ago that voicing her own needs in this family only made her seem difficult, dramatic, ungrateful. By the time Claire's wedding day arrived, Abby had already begun emergency dialysis to manage her declining kidney function. She wore a long-sleeve dress to hide the hospital band she hadn't had time to remove. She smiled in the photographs. She watched her sister take her first dance as a married woman, radiant under string lights, adored by 200 guests. Nobody there knew what it had cost the quiet sister in the corner just to still be standing upright. 6 weeks later, Abby finally had her transplant, but the delay had already done its damage. Complications extended her recovery for months. Months spent mostly alone in a hospital room, machines humming beside her, because her parents visited only briefly between errands, and Claire was away on an extended honeymoon in Europe. The only person who came every single evening without fail was her grandmother, Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor never offered empty reassurances. She didn't tell Abby that everything happens for a reason or that her family loved her in their own complicated way. She simply pulled a chair beside the bed, took Abby's hand in both of hers, and said gently but firmly, "You do not have to earn love by disappearing, sweetheart. Real love never asks you to make yourself smaller." Those quiet evenings became a foundation Abby would carry with her for the next 10 years. After she recovered, Abby made a decision that surprised everyone except perhaps her grandmother. She packed one suitcase, accepted a literacy coordinator position in Traverse City, Michigan, and quietly left the only home she had ever known. No dramatic goodbye, no slammed doors, just a woman finally choosing to build a life where nobody measured her against her sister, where nobody asked her to sit quietly in the background of her own story. It was peaceful there, in a small apartment above a bakery, with a view of Grand Traverse Bay from her fire escape. It was also, for a long while, terribly lonely. Eleanor called every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, without fail, and those calls became the highlight of Abby's week. Until, one October, they simply stopped. When Abby phoned home to ask why, she was told her grandmother was resting and didn't want visitors. Trusting them, as she always had, despite everything, she waited. She sent a card. She waited some more. 3 weeks later, a sympathy card arrived at her apartment, forwarded from her old address, in looping, unfamiliar handwriting. Eleanor had passed away 9 days earlier. The funeral was already over. Her own parents had kept her away deliberately, without so much as a phone call, to give her the chance to say goodbye. Abby drove 12 hours alone to visit her grandmother's grave, an old, worn paperback novel the two of them used to read together, sitting on the passenger seat the whole way. She sat in the grass beside the headstone for a long time before she finally spoke, quietly, promising herself she would never again let this family shape the direction of her life. Nearly 10 years passed. Abby built a modest, meaningful life in Michigan. Good friends, a job she loved, a small apartment full of books she'd rescued from library sales. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Brooks, my name is Daniel Harper. I'm an attorney. My office has been trying to locate you for quite some time." Abby assumed it was a scam. Instead, over the next hour, Daniel explained that her grandmother had left her the entirety of her estate, a successful regional bookstore chain, several commercial properties, an investment portfolio, and an educational trust, altogether worth several $1,000,000. "There's something else you should know," Daniel said carefully. "We sent certified legal notices to your parents' address repeatedly over several years. Every delivery confirmation carries the same signature." A pause. Diane Brooks. Abby sat in silence, the phone pressed against her ear as the full weight of it settled over her chest like something physical. Her mother had signed for those notices. Her mother had told the attorneys that Abby had vanished with no forwarding address, when in truth, she had simply moved 4 hours north and told her own parents exactly where. For nearly a decade, her inheritance and the independence it might have given her had been deliberately, methodically hidden from her. If she had known, she could have paid for her own medical care years sooner. She could have left home earlier. She might have made it in time to hold her grandmother's hand one last time. For a long while, Abby imagined confrontation. She pictured laying every certified letter, every falsified record across her parents' kitchen table and watching their carefully maintained composure finally crack. Some nights, that image felt like the only comfort available to her. But she kept hearing her grandmother's voice. "Real love never asks you to make yourself smaller." So instead of revenge, Abby made a different choice. She met with Daniel and legally transferred nearly the entire inheritance into a new nonprofit organization, the Eleanor Hayes Children's Learning Initiative, funding free neighborhood libraries, children's reading centers, literacy scholarships, and after-school tutoring programs throughout the Midwest. When Claire reached out months later, asking the family to meet, everyone assumed Abby wanted her share of some settlement, some argument over money. Instead, she arrived quietly, set a folder of certified letters and legal documents on the coffee table, and said nothing at first. "What is this?" Diane asked, her voice already tightening. "Proof," Abby said simply, "that you signed for Grandma's letters to me for almost 10 years, that you told her lawyers I disappeared, that you knew exactly where I was the entire time." The room went still. Thomas stared down at the table, unable to lift his eyes, his shoulders sinking under the weight of choices he had made, and the ones he hadn't. "Abby," he said, his voice cracking, "I told you I'd protect your surgery date. I didn't keep that promise, and I let this happen too. I am so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear it." Diane recovered faster. She began talking quickly about fairness, about how the estate should perhaps still be divided among the family, about how family always finds a way through. Abby simply shook her head. "It's already been donated," she said. "All of it. There's nothing left to divide." For the first time in her entire life, her mother had absolutely no leverage left to offer, no image left to protect, no outcome left within her control. Before she left that afternoon, Abby set her old, faded hospital wristband gently on top of the documents. It was a small, quiet gesture, but she didn't need to carry it with her anymore. The frightened young woman who once believed love had to be earned through sacrifice simply didn't exist anymore. 1 year later, the first Eleanor Hayes Learning Center opened inside a beautifully restored historic bookstore in northern Michigan, its shelves lined with donated books, its reading nook filled most afternoons with the sound of children's laughter. To Abby's quiet surprise, Claire began bringing her young daughter, Emma, to volunteer there on weekends. And slowly, carefully, something like an honest relationship began to grow between the two sisters. Not perfect, but real, built on truth instead of performance for the first time in their lives. Watching Emma grow up surrounded by books and encouragement that asked for nothing in return, Abby finally understood that the cycle her family had carried for generations had ended with her. She never received the family she once believed she deserved, but she built the legacy her grandmother always knew she was capable of. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. Like Abby, so many of you have given pieces of yourselves to families who never gave them back. And if today's story reminded you even a little that your worth was never meant to be earned, we'd be honored to have you with us for the next one. Real strength isn't found in revenge. It's found in the quiet moment you decide your life no longer belongs to the people who tried to make it smaller. As for the meaningful value in the story, it reflects a painful reality many people quietly carry. Growing up in families where favoritism shapes who gets protected and who gets overlooked, even in matters of health and safety, it illustrates why setting boundaries matters and why no family obligation should ever require sacrificing your own well-being. It also shows that healing doesn't require dramatic revenge, but can instead come through building something lasting and positive out of pain. Most importantly, it reminds viewers that generational cycles of neglect can be broken, and that a person's truest legacy is measured not by what they inherit, but by what they choose to give back to others.